Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think I'll get things started here. I got 3:17 on my end. I will make a few remarks after a short prayer, but again, even though we are miles apart, we are still connected here in Zoom, and the Holy Spirit is here with us. So we'll pray together. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Good and gracious God, bless and guide us in our work, in this conversation today, and in our response to come. Open our eyes to the needs of our sisters and brothers. Help us to see Christ in every person and in all of creation. Give us patience and perseverance in our work. Grace us with fellowship and community. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Well, again, I want to welcome you all to the call to the second session. We're blessed to have Manny Fernandez from Notre Dame here with us. I'm going to give a little shorter introduction to Manny in case we do have some new folks that are here that didn't hear the longer one last week, but we will be sending out the link to both sessions probably by this Friday, along with all the slides. So if you want a deeper background on Manny, you can go back and watch the first presentation. But I do want to just, again, for anybody that's new on the call this week, blessed to have Manny here. He is the program director of the Latino Enrollment Institute at Notre Dame. He's had a long career as an elementary, middle school, and high school teacher in Los Angeles and Goshen, Indiana. Manny joined the ACE team at Notre Dame to help facilitate the improvement and expansion of Catholic education within the Latino population. So Manny, we're excited to have you here again today. I did ask Manny to keep a couple or two or three of the same slides in to kick things off, just in case, again, we had some new folks, just to speak a little bit again to the why we're having this conversation. So Manny, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Patrick. It's great to be here again. Once again, we have Jo Jones. If she's not here, she will be. She was on a call, but from Notre Dame Prep in Towson, Maryland. In case you weren't here with us last week, Jo is one of the best in the business, and she's here to give us some thoughts near the end and help answer any questions you may have. So let's look at the cultural angle of all this. Now, last week we talked about recruiting more Latino children to our schools. Before we do that, we truly believe we should make sure our schools are ready for them. How can we invite these families into our schools and then not serve their needs at all, or not make them feel at home in our schools? We often mistakenly say we want to make our schools welcoming, quote unquote, to people of all nationalities and ethnicities. I make that same mistake myself, using the word welcoming. But you make guests feel welcome. We don't want to treat our students and their families as guests. We want to make them feel like they are at home. Because what will happen is these families that don't feel like they are at home, they'll stay for a year, if that, and then they'll return to their old school or to a different school, something easier for them, something more at home. And we know that that's not a sustainable model. It's not healthy for the children to be switching schools, the families, nor the faculty at your school. I'm sure there are schools on this call that enrolled students due to the fact that public schools went completely virtual in your area. Obviously, we want to keep those new students. To lose them because the school's culture left them feeling cold would be awful, and it's not something we want to do. So we're going to try to help you avoid that. Now, Patrick said we've already seen these, but just in case someone's new, we want to look at some of the stats on the Latino population. Bear with me if you've seen these before, but they're really important. Out of 8 million school-aged Latino Catholics, only 318,000 are enrolled in Catholic schools, barely 4% of this population. Latinos are among the most devout Catholics you will find. They are clearly going to be a large and important part of the future of the Catholic Church in the United States. And yet, our Catholic schools, the #1 evangelizers of the Catholic faith in our country, are largely failing to adequately serve this important population. And there's some major reasons why we believe you should be serving this demographic, diversity being diversity as a strength included in those reasons. But one of the most important reasons can be found when you look at the raw numbers. The average age of Latinos in the United States is just 27. For comparison, the average age of their non-Hispanic white counterparts is 42. Due to their young age, Hispanics are driving the majority of population growth in the country, even though they make up just 18% of the population. I'll go a little further. 42% of the Catholics in the United States right now are Latino. The younger you go, the more Latino it gets. Latino Catholics under the age of 18 make up 63% of the Catholic Church in the United States. So we can't expect the Catholic Church to grow if we leave Latino children out of the equation. The math just doesn't work. Now, a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Southern California, and I taught out there until I met my wife, who was doing a volunteer year out there. She's from South Bend, Indiana. She went to Notre Dame, and we eventually moved to her hometown of South Bend about 8 years ago. Where we are raising our 3 kids, who you see here. That's Alyssa, who is 9. Now that was probably when she was 7. That picture. Luke, who's almost 7, and Shavi, who is 1.5. There are 2 reasons why I show you these pictures. Number one, if I bomb today and you hate this presentation, and Patrick asks you to assess how I did, before you answer that, think about my wonderful kids and maybe go easy on me in your review, because Daddy wants to keep working and I need this job. Number 2, in all seriousness, what I've done is built a little bit of relationship with you, and hopefully you got to buy in a little bit. And if there's one thing you get out of today's talk, I want you to know that if you want to make inroads with the Latino population, and we talked about it last week, you must build relationships with Latino families and their children. So at the heart of everything we do at the LEI is building and sustaining authentic relationships. Whether it's school culture, classroom management, marketing, advancement, you name it, so much of what makes our schools successful with Latino families, students, and the Latino community at large is the relationship piece. In the Latino culture and most of the world outside of the US, really, relationships matter the most. Whereas Americans tend to value time and are task-oriented, Latinos value relationships. For example, Latinos have a harder time when they're dealing with a typical Western doctor who might seem hurried, detached, or aloof, reducing the likelihood of compliance with the doctor's recommendations for treatment and follow-up because they don't feel that relationship carrying piece. In their minds, a physician should be relationship builders and be attentive, take their time, show respect, and if possible, communicate in Spanish. And the same thing can be said about school leaders and educators. Latinos will respond better to relationship builders who show care over someone who is business-like and task-oriented. Now, I'm not judging either set of values. I see value in both relationships and being task-oriented, like Americans tend to be. And believe me, I get as frustrated as the next guy when Latinos show up late to events. But I'm just saying that there's a difference in culture, and there's nothing wrong with it. And so what we say time and time again is that you have to build relationships in order to attract and serve Latino families. So let's begin. We've come up with 7 major things you can do immediately at your school in order to make your students and families from different backgrounds feel comfortable at your school. I already showed you this one, so we're going to skip it. So number 1, let's take you should, if you can, take a tour of your school with a Latino parent or Latino parents. Consider doing a walkthrough of the school with a madrina or school family, someone you trust, and ask them to give you feedback on the overall feel of the school and its environment. Find out from them if your school is culturally responsive to the Latinos in the school community. This means physically and socially. Make a note of what is welcoming and what is not welcoming, and make any necessary changes and or additions. 9 times out of 10, the most dominant culture will already feel at home in your school. And here's the thing that you'll have to address when you get pushback from certain parents or staff members. It's not about pushing the dominant culture out at all. They should be seen and heard as well. It's about also giving room for other cultures in the school. You can consider this like a self-audit with the help of some outside eyes that have the ability to see things you might not be able to see. It's always good and important to get a fresh set of eyes to view something that you see every day. It's like your kids. You see them so much, it's hard to notice the change in them until your cousin comes over for the first time in 6 months and talks about how much they've changed. We can get an outside perspective from an expert in our culture, an expert in their culture, free of charge, simply by tapping into the pool of parents at our own schools. If you have a school representing multiple nationalities, take a tour of the school with different sets of parents and get their thoughts on what they see and experience. Ask questions. How can you make your school more responsive? What small changes can you make to ensure that current and potential families feel at home, both physically and mentally, socially? Now, here's a school we worked with in Kansas, and one of our mentor principals visited the school and took this picture of the hallways. It's a pretty typical high school hallway. It's got framed pictures of previous graduating classes and walls with kind of drab colors. Our challenge to everyone is how can we make a school like this look and feel more culturally responsive to its students? And this brings us to number 2. Incorporate culturally responsive imagery and a lot of color in the building. Put to use what you've learned through walkthroughs. Even if you don't do any walkthroughs, think about some quick fixes to make your school more culturally responsive. It's the little things. When you get to the point where Latinos are a presence in your school, think about maybe doing the mission statement in both languages, using directional signs in both languages, using using religious imagery to show value of other cultures, display cultural items. And maybe if you have space, a special place for visitors to gather and talk, or for parent groups to do work. For example, if your families are of a Mexican descent, consider placing images of Our Lady of Guadalupe, or for Dominicans, Our Lady of Divine Mercy, especially at the entrance where inquiring families have the first impression of the school. If you see the picture on the left, you'll see a picture in a school in Columbus, Ohio, who actually got Our Lady of Guadalupe statue donated to them, and they put it right in the front of the school. In the lobby, you can make a map or some visual of where all the families in your schools come from. You can see here that a principal added a simple sign in Spanish for the principal's office. And this is a really poor school. If you look on the right, you can see that they need a paint job, but they did find that this was important, and they worked on it. Also, add some color to your building. Now, here's a picture of a Mexican, of your typical Mexican restaurant. Now, to me, this is hideous. Here's another. I don't like those colors. I mean, it's like too much for me. There's thousands of these Mexican restaurants across the country with the same general look, vibrant colors. Again, not my style, but I'm not Mexican. My dad's Spanish, my mom's Dominican. This isn't my culture. It's not for me. But what you see in these pictures is, again, a vibrancy, lots of color. This is what home feels like to many Latino families. Now you contrast that to the hallway I showed you earlier. And obviously, let's see here, again, there's a big difference there. You can see how the vibe would be so different. Now, I'm not saying turn your school into a clown college, but how can you give your school a little bit more color, a little bit more culture? In Spanish, you say poco a poco, little by little. We're not asking you to change, the world here, but if you can do little things, that would be great. For example, here's an all-girls school in Southern California that painted a mural outside their school to add life and color to an otherwise drab wall. And here's a picture of a hallway of a school we work with in New York, where any chance they get to spruce up their hallways with colors to make the place come alive for them, they do it. They even went and got pink chairs when they needed new chairs, because they realized the small things they were doing went a long way with not only the Latino families, but the students as well. Let's look at number 3 now. Become a student of your current family's cultures. I know for many schools on this call, you're going to have a lot more Puerto Ricans and Dominicans than Mexicans. In the neighborhoods of other schools on this call, you're going to see some Peruvians, Colombians, which is not something you necessarily see in other parts of the country. And then you have a growing population of Mexican Americans in the northern eastern parts of the country as well. So it'd be wise to get to know the various cultures of your students that your students represent. Because just like most Americans have things in common, you will also see that the average Texan, for example, is far different than the average New Yorker. The same thing goes for Latinos. So for example, Puerto Ricans, they celebrate their Catholic faith differently than maybe you and I do. Puerto Ricans are predominantly Catholic, yet their beliefs, rituals, and practices often stray outside the, quote unquote, normal orthodox boundaries of Catholicism. So of course they celebrate things in quote unquote normal, in the normal way in the church for special celebrations such as baptisms, marriages, vigils, etc. But afterwards, Puerto Ricans celebrate by singing, playing music, drinking, and feasting. And the same goes for other religious and political holidays. Them and Dominicans and Cubans and other Latinos, they celebrate with great enthusiasm. I can remember when I graduated 8th grade, my principal, I graduated mostly Asians, but our principal said, do not, whatever you do, make noise, have your families make noise during the graduation. When they say your name, it has to be calm. That was not going to fly with my Dominican family. They brought cowbells, they brought tick, 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 tick. So when they said my name, it was like just a party. The Asian families just were like, their eyes were open. I'll never forget the look on my principal's face. It was just a look of ultimate disappointment, but there was no way they were going to get my family not to celebrate. And it was 8th grade. It was not even a big deal, but to them, it was a chance to party. Same thing at my wedding. I married an Anglo woman, and you know, it was a good wedding. And then, but when the merengue came on, when the salsa music came on, it was a totally different feel. Neither was wrong. It was just different. And so same thing goes for our students. You can take advantage of these rich cultures that are such assets for your school. Food is always a great way to bring people together, as you can see here with a mother and daughter team selling churros for the girls soccer team at a Catholic school in Los Angeles. And here you see this beautiful altar celebrating the lives and deaths of family members of a class for Dia de los Muertos, which is a huge celebration the Mexican community celebrates the day after Halloween. A school we work with in Arizona started a mariachi club, and their students would perform for the school and eventually for events all over the city. It became a huge, like a source of pride for the school. Of course, this is far down the line for many of you, but it's good to see what is possible. Keeping with this theme, in the Latino community, sacraments are huge. You won't be dealing with first communions, but you will see confirmations. And once again, the way Latinos, many Latinos celebrate may differ from what you're used to. They celebrate sacraments in the church, which we all do, and then they keep the celebration going with a huge party afterwards. If you ever get invited, first of all, that's a huge compliment, and shows that you've made a real effort to build a relationship with the family. Second of all, it's a hell of a lot of fun. Latinos know how to have a good time, and you will enjoy yourself. So for example, for your typical first-generation Latino family, you will have the sacrament, say the baptism, and you will have what they call the bautismo, which is just the church part. What happens at the church. And then you have the bautizo, which is the party. If they invite you to the church and not the party, you're either really boring or you made the wrong people mad. But if they do invite you to the party, it's a great time. But they do make it a real celebration. And the church part is important, but the getting together with everybody and the family is also equally important for them. And then you have quinceañeras, which is a celebration of a girl's 15th birthday and her transition from childhood to adulthood. And it involves a mass followed by usually a rather large party. It's like a sweet 16 or a debutante ball, except for the religious aspect is extremely important. First, you have the church, and then you have the big party. Now, to outsiders, it's a big waste. And believe me, I get that. It's a lot of money. But to them, it's a rite of passage in the eyes of the Lord and of the church. It is a huge deal. So it's an extremely important event for families that are in your school or could be coming to your school. And it's important that we respect that and honor that. All right, let's move on to number 5. Focus on creating positive first impressions for inquiring families visiting your school. First impressions are everything, both in person and even on the phone. Think about your school as if you had never been there before or have never called before. How welcoming is it? How inviting is it? Focus on your gatekeeper. Your front office is your PR firm. And I know I showed you this last time, but if your front office person looks like this all the time, you've already lost. The secretary of my old school used to wonder why we got so many prank calls, where she would answer the phone and people would hang up on her instead of talking. But it was because of the way she answered the phone. She would say, "Same bits at school." And then parents would be like, click. They would hang up. They got scared. They got, nervous, especially if you're a Spanish speaking person. And she spoke Spanish, but she just gave that vibe that was not welcoming. And eventually they had to let her go because she just refused to change. So a welcoming first front office person is essential, even if he or she does not speak Spanish. This hurts not only in recruiting potential students, but let's be real, it hurts efficiency within the school because no one wants to approach a mean administrative assistant. A smile is universal. This person must be personable, must know how to engage people, and must like his or her job. If you don't have one, I highly recommend you create a protocol for all front office personnel. Now, I realize that this is a delicate situation for some of you. You might be a new principal or president, and I'm telling you that you might need to tell beloved Sally Gatekeeper, who's been there for 20 years and says she knows everything. I'm telling you to tell her to change something that she thinks is fine. Well, for you school leaders out there, that is why Patrick gave you a huge raise of $475 to become the principal. You get the big bucks to make these difficult conversations, to have these difficult conversations. And seriously, I do know that this is a difficult situation for many, but it's something we strongly believe in. You have to have an affable, approachable front office person. And when the time presents itself, you have to hire someone personable. It's a must. And if it's a huge plus if that person could speak Spanish, if you are starting to get a higher Spanish-speaking clientele. Sticking with the theme of first impressions, what does your office look like? Do you have space for families, entire families, which may include an uncle and 2 grandparents and kids and 2 nephews? Do you have that space to have conferences or fill out forms? Look at this picture right here. It's a perfect office, clean, beautiful furniture. But it's not the right office to host a large family. It won't work for your typical Latino family. And then you see this picture of a nook in a principal's office. Now, sorry for the blurry picture, but I use it because it perfectly encapsulates what a forward-looking principal does. You have kids here with children's book. This is a high school principal that knows that there's going to be children coming in, and so she had the foresight to bring books in here and sometimes toys for children to play in. This way, the family feels like, okay, we can be here, we can feel comfortable, and we can get the business done without having to hire a babysitter. So you want a better space. Again, what does your office and classroom look like? Are there children's books, activities where you meet with prospective families? Excuse me. Another tip: don't let your parent reception area also be the area where students who are in trouble wait to see the principal. No one wants to see that, parents, especially prospective parents. Same for teachers. For parent conferences for Latino families, how many chairs do they have out? These little things can go a long way. But of course, it's more than the physical layout. Culture is more an attitude that starts at the top with the principal. Our research shows that the principal or the president is the most important lever of change in a school. But it doesn't just stop there. It needs to be a school-wide initiative. All staff members can be visible and approachable and exhibit the type of mentality and culture your school wants to exude. The old parking lot PR that so many school leaders take advantage of. So this needs to be a school-wide initiative. And when I say school-wide, I mean everybody. As I just mentioned, your staff needs to be on board. This means you might have to have some uncomfortable conversations if they do not want to get on board. This means you will have to coach your staff on many of the things you have learned here and throughout your time as an educator. You're going to have many staff members who might not have gone through some of the things that your students are going through. They might not know how different cultures have different social norms. For example, when you tell a student, look at me in the eyes when I'm talking to you, for the average American child, that means what you're telling them is look at me in the eyes because that's a sign of respect. But for the average Latino child, they're taught if you look an adult in the eyes, you're showing them disrespect. And so when you say, look me in the eyes and they're looking down, they don't want to be disrespectful to you. And you might take that as being disrespectful. I know I tell my kids, look me in the eyes so that I know that they're listening. Now, most of the time, they're not listening. They do the exact opposite that I asked them to. But we want them to look at us. So it's just a matter of, letting your teachers know that there's different social norms. If your entire staff can relay a message to current prospective parents, then that is a huge plus for your marketing. Now, custodians, they also can create a positive curb appeal and create a positive vibe throughout the school. They're part of the school culture. The kitchen staff, who can create a loving, fun vibe in the cafeteria. And especially clergy that you have either on campus or who come to your campus to celebrate. This picture of a student taking communion from a priest is a screenshot of a video that we shot for a high school in Northern California. The priest obviously had a relationship with this student, and whatever he said made the student break out into a huge grin. I love this picture because that shows a pastor helping the culture of a school in immeasurable ways. So all of these aforementioned people are vitally important to the culture of your school. And of course, maybe most importantly, are your classrooms culturally responsive? This is something for if any teachers are out here, or for your teachers. Here at the LAI, we've been talking about making schools and classrooms culturally responsive since we started all the way back in 2012, and about being vocally and openly anti-racist. But the country as a whole has been awoken to this necessity in the past year. And I've witnessed high school students being more emboldened to speak their thoughts on racism, inequality, justice, more than I've ever seen. And I have no doubt that you're seeing the same things in your schools with your students. And so teachers, it's not enough now to bring out a novel written by a Black author during Black History Month and consider that your foray into diversity for the year. So like if you look at this screen and the pictures on this screen, you can bring in a small statue of or a picture of Our Lady of Guadalupe. You can celebrate Dia de los Muertos. You can have books that have Hispanic, Latino protagonists written by Latino authors, and there's some great YL books out there. You can, hang pictures of doctors and architects that are Latino. I have no problem with like movie stars or even, baseball stars or, athletes that are portrayed there as being, successful. I think about my mom. My mom was born in the Dominican Republic and then moved to Spanish Harlem when she was a child. And here's Jackie Robinson. There's a picture of Jackie Robinson, who, of course, broke the color barrier. And so my mom is in Spanish Harlem, and she really wanted to do something with her life. And she had two major strikes against her. Number one, she was a woman. And so they said, you can only do two things. You can be a nurse, or three things: nurse, teacher, or housewife. And the second thing is she was brown. And so then they said, no, you can only be a housewife or work in a factory. And she didn't want that. She wanted more for her life. Not that there's anything wrong with being a housewife, but it just wasn't for her. And she was brilliant, and she knew she wanted to do more. And then along came Jackie Robinson, and that was the first person of color that had made it out of the ghetto. She had never seen that. No one had ever seen that where she was from. And she said, if he can do it, I can do it. And now, fast forward, this is in the early 50s. So fast forward 70 years later, and she's a teacher, award-winning teacher. She got her master's, her college degree, her master's, her doctorate. She became an author of poetry and of children's books. And in every single book, she dedicates her book to a lot of people, but every single one is to Jackie Robinson. That's a person of color that made it. And so 70 years later, she still remembers that. And so our children, our students, it's okay to look up to Messi and Ronaldo and those people like that, in my opinion, because they're successful. They're not, they're not doing the wrong thing. Of course, athletes let us down all the time, but it's something to look up to. So our classes need to be culturally responsive. And there's so much more when it comes to the classroom, and we don't have time to dive into it. But the things I talked about on the previous slides are some ways to at least get started in making your classrooms more culturally responsive to the needs of your students. I know personally, I do a whole hour and a half on this when people come to the LEI. So it's really near and dear to my heart. All right, let's move on to number 6. Examine how you treat your Latino immigrant families. Are your current Latino families treated differently or made to feel inferior, even by accident? Are your fundraisers and family events always centered on other communities? When Latino families are reticent to volunteer or participate in social outings, have you asked why that is? Now, there are reasons for everything, and the answers might surprise you. We need another whole webinar just to talk about Latino parent involvement, so we can't get into that right now. In fact, tomorrow I'm filming a session for the NCEA conference on just that very topic. But there's things you can do. So you can examine your translated documents. You can examine your fundraisers. You can examine your social events. For example, let's look at one school that we worked with that had Monte Carlo night versus a multicultural night. They wanted to know why their school was becoming more and more Latino. It was growing, but they were adding a lot of Latino families, and they wanted to integrate the Latino families into their school, and they would have this huge casino night that they they ran for years, but the Latino families wouldn't go. And why is that? Well, they didn't want to gamble. The gambling just wasn't for them. This type of gambling, they'll gamble on, on other things, but this type of gambling just wasn't for them. And so having a Monte Carlo night wasn't working. So the school decided to host, a multicultural night, and that blew up. And as you could see here, the colors, we go back to the colors. And there's African-American families there, there's Anglo families, there's, of course, Latino families, and they all brought food from their cultures. And it was just a way bigger hit. It wasn't about making the money as much as it was about bringing everybody together. Now, they did make money off it, but it was more about bringing the school together. And they, here's some more pictures, and you could see, what it looked like. And they, they had people dance, they had students dancing and all kinds of things. So that's something, to think about. They also went back into the classrooms, obviously pre-COVID, and, they brought the congas out, and they did just a lot of different things. So something to think about when you're doing that. Now, number 7, educate your faculty and staff and current school families on the gifts that culturally and linguistically diverse children bring to the school community. Focus on the abundance model, not the deficit model. Celebrate what your students bring to the classroom rather than be discouraged by what they seemingly can't do at first. Have your teachers empower students by letting the Latino students know that the gifts of their culture are a strength to the classroom and to the community. And in the same token, offer PD to your faculty on how to teach linguistically diverse students, ENL classes, for example. Some people think like once they get to high school, they don't need, English language learning courses for their students. And that's just, not true. A lot of the students will speak, English, but not academic English, and they struggle with that. And so when you don't have to have an ENL course, but if you bring ENL scaffolding into your classroom, it helps all students, not just, the students that English is their second language. So it's important to do that. You can turn negative stereotypes into positives. They're always late is something that we hear a lot. And like I said earlier, relationships and other things are more important to them than time. Now, that's beautiful in some ways because they care more about people than the clock. That's also maddening if you have to be in school at 8 o'clock and you're starting a lesson at 8 o'clock and a family's constantly coming in at 8:10, 8:15. Obviously, that's not good, healthy for the school, for the teacher, for the kids. But it's just something that we need to educate. But again, them being late a lot of times is just a result of a different culture, and it's just something we need to teach. We talked about it again. They never want to volunteer or participate. Well, they might feel out of place because of language barriers, class status differences, or simply not understanding how the American system of education works. In Latin America, the school does the teaching at school. The parents do the teaching at home. And so there is a separation, and they don't want to, and they think if they come into the school, a lot of Latino parents think that they're stepping they're stepping on the toes of the wrong people. Like, you are the experts. Why should I try to help you? Because we trust you. You went to school, you're the expert. And in the American system, it's more of a partnership. Well, these things can be mitigated through communication and, of course, relationship building. Another stereotype, they don't care about academics. We hear that a lot, again, because the parents leave it up to the school. Well, there's a different perspective on education for the American perspective versus the Latino perspective. To be well educated, what does that mean? The American version is different than the Latino version. The American version will say, the definition is the level of your education, your critical thinking skills, the level of literacy. But the Latino definition is moral responsibility, social responsibility, personal responsibility. So when they send their children to Catholic schools, they're expecting they're expecting us to teach the whole child. And that's what Catholic education is all about. So when you say buen educado in Spanish, well educated, They're talking about the whole human being. So it's just a different way to look at education. I'm not saying either one is correct or incorrect. I personally want my children to have everything. I think we all do. And some schools really focus on academics and leave the other part behind. There's a quote from Aristotle that I just love. Educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. And that's basically what Latino families are looking at when they send their children to Catholic schools. They're expecting the whole thing. And as Christians and as Catholics and the universal church, that's what we want to give them. Now, we do have a little bit more time, and I did want to go to number 8. I wanted to, this is sometimes I don't have time for this, but we do have a little bit more time. I think it's great if the more Latinos we get, if we can make an honest effort to learn 35 phrases in Spanish. The smallest gestures go a long way. If you learn a listening Spanish vocabulary, that's extremely beneficial. A simple phrase like los baños están allá, the bathrooms are over there, it can go a long way. And if you know Spanish already, learn some phrases specific to one or more of the cultures of your students' families. And if you're speaking English to a non-native speaker, don't just talk louder, but do speak slowly, even in English. Learn a slang word and try it with your students and or parents. So like the Puerto Ricans will say Boricua, that means Puerto Rican. And it's much easier to say than Puerto Riqueño. If you say Boricua, if there's any teachers here, your students will go crazy if you say that to a Puerto Rican. They'll just love you. Broki, that means buddy. And then mano is short for brother, hermano. It means brother or bro, like a close friend. Be careful though. I got in trouble one time in as a teacher. I said the word way. Way in Spanish for Mexicans means dude, bro. So I said "Ándale güey," which means come on, dude, to a student, and they're 5th graders. And half of my students busted up. The other half just gasped in horror. Well, the other half were from El Salvador, and in El Salvador it means a bad word that starts with A. And so I called my student a bad word that starts with A. That was a good introduction to learning the culture of your students. So I stuck my foot in my mouth, and instead of calling a student dude, I called him a jerk, basically. So something to think about when you're doing that. So all of these things can really help your school become more culturally responsive to the needs of your students and your families.
Thank you, Manny. And Manny, I think I did see Joe join us here. Would you mind just reintroducing Joe, and maybe Joe can just make a few comments, share a little bit more about her background for those that are new on the call?
Yeah, Joe Jones, we met her in, let me stop sharing here. We met her in 2012, 2013, Joe, and she is a fantastic school leader. She was working at an elementary school and really got a school in Holland, Michigan, to become so much more culturally diverse than it was before she got there. A thriving school. She's now at Notre Dame Prep out in Towson, Maryland. She serves on the board of a lot of different schools and companies, and so her knowledge and wisdom is always appreciated and sought after. So Joe, what can you add to what I said?
First of all, if you're having some feelings of culture shock, as in you're thinking that's never going to fly in my building, I'm not going to introduce color or statues or things of that nature, that's because you're just entering into it. I would share with you, and I shared this last week for whoever's on the call, the life in our community it just had so much depth added to it the more we embrace diversity. And our diversity happened to be with Latino families. And even to the extent of the first Christmas, and missteps all the way, as Manny's saying, but the first Christmas that I had a bilingual novena, and I had 2 moms build a beautiful shrine out of brown paper that they crinkled, and dozens of roses, and a statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe, they felt embraced, they felt part of it. And every year after that, they built a different and more beautiful expression of that and put it in different places. And eventually people noticed and said things, and on and on and on and on. And one thing that I did was to have a welcoming space. I had a room across from the office that was just useless, and we made it extremely vibrant, put art in it, toys for children, and a table to sit at. And I think I spoke of this in the video that I made for Notre Dame. I got invited to lunch there by Latino families. They brought food in and invited me to lunch in that space because for them, that space was a micro home. It was where they felt loved and accepted and welcomed if they were early or late or waiting for a ride. So if any of this strikes you as, oh my goodness, it's just one step at a time. You know, and it does start with being open and accepting that your culture is just one culture, and it has room to grow, definitely has room to grow, and you will be blessed for it, for sure. Any questions? Everybody's a high school, Manny?
Patrick, you can answer that better than I
We've
can.
got a few schools that I see here that have middle school programs. I'm looking to see if we have any Lowell Catholic as our one school that's a pre-K to 12. But
You
the
know,
majority of schools are high school and middle school and high school.
I knew I had arrived as a leader when one year my social calendar was packed with weddings and quinceañeras and showers and going to someone's house for a meal. And I realized that something had happened. And, you know, it was, and the cultural thing I realized is like the first time I got invited to something, I went with a friend of mine. We showed up exactly on time and they laughed at us. They were like, "You're early." And then we stayed like a half an hour late and felt like super self-conscious, super white. And the next day saw some other friends that happened to be Latinas that were there. And they said, "Oh my gosh, we called like 12 more people and the party went till midnight. I don't know why you left at 6. I'm like, "Because you told me it was from 3 to 6. Like, I'm white. I thought that was what the thing was." And they're like, "No, there was still food. There was still drink. They just kept going." And what I thought to myself is, you need to drink a little of that Kool-Aid. You need to flex it a little bit and be a little bit more, you know, open to things. Don't always go as planned. They can go so much better than planned. So it's really, it's amazing what it'll do for your school. Truly amazing.
On that party,
if I
I could share my own experience with in Omaha, as I shared last week on the call. You know, Manny, you talked about multicultural nights. What we ended up doing, and it was family driven, is a lot of times the families would look at the schedules of the schools, see what big basketball games were coming up, and basically a Saturday would turn into this huge party. The families love to make food, bring the food. You know, we just basically have a party going on campus. In addition to the games, you know, people coming through, a lot of folks would just come, whether they had a tie to the school or not, to be a part of the multicultural event that was happening about once a month. All the profits from that, the families would turn over to the school to help subsidize some of the financial aid they were receiving. So, I mean, it was a great event, from a fundraising to a friend raising to just a great community piece. But yeah, I can agree that that party piece was very easy to pull together when the families felt invited. I think, Alex, were you going to ask a question?
Yeah. So Manny, and thank you so much. And Joe, thank you so much for offering the perspective. You know, I just, from my own personal experience, so I'm first generation Cuban American. My parents came over from Cuba in the early 60s. I grew up in Miami, so Manny Fernandez to me is a very important name because it was a very great Miami Dolphin back in the day.
You know that name, yeah.
No, absolutely. Yeah, part of the undefeated season. But you know, I want to reiterate, first, from my own experience, the level of complexity in treating the entire Latinx community. It's sort of, even having this conversation is difficult for me because just with every country of origin, even within countries, there are divisions that are created, whether you're more on the sort of native population side, you're more on the Spanish side, whether you're the descendants of slaves that were brought over. It is a terribly complex issue, which is not easy. It doesn't mean we don't try to embrace it, and it doesn't mean we don't try to make our communities a space and a place where our families feel that they're part of it. I agree with you, Manny, that it's not just welcoming; it's that they're part of it. My roommate in college for 3 years was a gentleman from Puerto Rico, and so we used to joke because we're Cuban and Puerto Rico, very close to each other, but it was two different. And his father was Cuban, so but we had very different worlds. The way we said things, the way we spoke, and I have a vivid memory of. My roommate had a tough time his freshman year. I was homesick, but he was home. He had it worse. And one of the guys on our hall, again, very sincere, very, very honest. He's like, well, why don't we throw him a fiesta and we can all wear like Mexican hat, just trying to do the right thing, but just so amazingly offensive that I think sometimes what that does is it creates a hesitation, or it creates a concern on our part that we don't want to offend. But just emphasizing that point of the level of complexity. There's a great Cuban comedian, Alvarez Guedes, who does a whole routine on words that mean different things in different cultures. Like there's a word in Spanish that if you said that in another foreign country, you get your another Spanish-speaking country, you get your face slapped. So it's really complex, but it doesn't mean that you don't embrace it. And I think the advice of engaging with the community, the madrina, having that sort of voice as part of your process is going to be really, really important. So I appreciate the time, and I appreciate your ability to explain something that is terribly complex in a way that I think is accessible to all of us. So thank you.
Thanks, Alex. And I will, we can't treat it like a monolith. We in Los Angeles, which is a gateway city. We've had our school, we had fourth generation, Latino Americans, and immigrants that just crossed the border in the same school, and they're totally different as well. And then you have the millennial parents that are a lot different than the immigrant parents that might just be working in a factory or something. So totally different. And again, even though my school in Los Angeles was pretty 95% Latino, it was a lot different. You had a lot of different stakeholders to deal with. So yeah, thanks, Alex.
Well, and I would add, Alex, that what you're talking about, we're dealing with all over the country at our Catholic schools. I was thinking of our school, one of the principals that I mentored in Lynn, Massachusetts, John Dolan's school, had a wide variety of cultures. I think the thing is, it does not come off genuine if it comes from the majority population as you're converting your school, because I converted a school. You have to seek it from the different constituent groups, that respect for culture. And one other thing that I think is essential, because whether you're a pre-K 12 or a 9-12 or a 7-12, children will sometimes feel ashamed of their culture as they enter high school, just like other children might all of a sudden think their dad dresses funny, and we can do so much for their well-being by honoring culture, by just really respecting. And the broad brush that you do have is Catholicism. And that is both a universal religion and one for which you're talking the majority of these cultures deeply and spiritually embrace. And I think that is something to take to heart, because that really is a powerful tool. So, yeah.
I'm going to share one more thing, and then I promise I'll stop. So between kindergarten and 6th grade, I refused to speak Spanish, right? That was because I went to a school that was, ironically, in Miami at the time, there was still a school that was not majority Spanish speaking. And I refused to speak Spanish. I only spoke out of necessity to my grandparents because they couldn't speak English very well. And the funny, my mom would always say, you should really practice your Spanish. It's going to help you get a job one day. It wasn't until I entered the Jesuit middle school, high school in Miami, which was a school that came over from Cuba in the early 60s. So when Castro, one of its most famous alums, shut the Catholic schools down, they started the school in Miami. It wasn't until I went there and I started to see students that were embracing, and most of them were Cuban, embracing that aspect of their culture. I had teachers who could barely speak English, so it just became it became very comfortable for me. So and it's something where when I went to college, I was very proud to defend where my family came from, because in the Northeast there's some very interesting ideas around the Cuban Revolution.
Mhm.
But it's that important piece of being in a place where I felt like I was valued, and the culture was valued, and I was required to take Latin American history, which half of the year was Cuban history. So that piece is really important. But that refusal to speak Spanish was something that's very real. So you may see that with families as well. And then, of course, the great irony is my first teaching job was teaching Spanish.
Well, Alex, I had the opposite experience. I wish I had that. I grew up in Orange County, Southern California. I was the only brown face in the school. We lived in a very poor area, but my mom was smart enough to get me into the richer and more affluent school. She used an illegal address. And so she stopped speaking to me in Spanish when I was 5, so I wouldn't have an accent, so I wouldn't get picked on. And so I lost Spanish until I was 16. I went to Spain with my dad and for a summer, and kind of got immersed in and relearned the language. But the fear of racism that my mom had, now she regrets it now, of course, because speaking 2 languages is a superpower. But back then she was just so worried of what I would go through. So yeah, what you say there is real in both directions. Absolutely. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments for our guests today? Okay, well, we will be putting out links to both presentations. So for those that do want to watch those afterwards, you'll have that opportunity. We'll pass along emails for Manny and Joe. Thank you as well. May pass along your email if you do have questions for them. And again, our office based out of Baltimore as well would love to be a resource for all of you. Whether that's ways we can support you or putting you in touch with other resources. For the administrators on the call and for the administrators that do end up watching this afterwards, again, Manny has never once asked me to make this plug. I'm making it from my own experience, but the LEI summer conference at Notre Dame is fantastic. And I would encourage you to find a way to get out there. Manny, I think if I remember back then, it used to just be transportation to get out there. I don't know if the costs are still subsidized or if there's
no, it's $1,000, $1,050 now for 4 days or 3.5 days. That includes housing, all meals while you're on campus. You get a mentor principal throughout the year. You get modules that have themes. Every month we have a theme that you'll have a Zoom call with someone like Joe and 4 other principals, and you'll talk about, let's say, Hispanic Heritage Month or community or finances, things like that. And then we accept title funds. So I'd say about 65% of the schools pay through title funds.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. But again, I'd encourage it for administrators to give it some consideration to head out there. It's, I think I said in the last week, I must have had about 20 plus principals in the past go to it, and they all came back on fire for this topic and just made dramatic strides in their local communities, putting to work the knowledge that Notre Dame gave them. So again, I'd like to thank, did I hear a voice?
I was just going to say, you'll get light years ahead if you go to something like that. I'm not sure where we stand for this summer, but it will propel you to action when you go to that conference, much more than anything else, I think.
Agreed. Well, thank you all for your attendance today. Again, we'll get that information out to you. You know where to find us if you do have follow-up questions. And on behalf of the sponsorship office and the brothers, for all the educators on the call, we continue to be so grateful for the work that you're doing to help fulfill the mission of the brothers, help fulfill the mission of Xaverian Brothers sponsored schools, particularly in this COVID environment. So bless you all for the work that you do. Have a great day. Thank you.
God bless.